They called it a breakthrough. 60 years later, it broke everything else. The call came in at 2:47 in the morning. A man, unresponsive, slumped behind the wheel of a silver Honda Civic parked on the corner of Salem Avenue and Apple Street in Dayton, Ohio. Engine still running, hazard lights blinking in the November dark. Dana Kowalski had been a paramedic for 14 years. She had seen things that don't leave a person. Bodies pulled from rivers, children after car crashes, a man who had been burning for 6 minutes before anyone called 911. She was not someone who hesitated. She pulled the naloxone from her kit before her partner had finished parking the rig. Naloxone. Most people have never heard of it. It is the drug that reverses an opioid overdose. It binds to the same receptors in the brain that opioids attach to and physically pushes them off, like a key turning in a lock that another key had already jammed. It works within minutes. In most cases, it works within seconds. One dose, and a person who was minutes from death opens their eyes, gasping, confused, alive. Dana administered the first dose. Nothing. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. People are watching this from every corner of the world, and that never stops being remarkable. She waited the 30 seconds she'd been trained to wait. The man's chest was rising barely. His lips had a colour that wasn't quite right. Not blue, not grey, something between the two. She administered the second dose, watching his face for the flicker of response that should have come by now. Still nothing. Her partner already had the third syringe ready. That wasn't protocol. That was experience talking. Because this was the third time this week, on this same street, in the same zip code, that one dose hadn't been enough. He handed it to her without a word. The third dose hit. The man's body lurched. His eyes opened, not gradually, not gently, but all at once, like a door kicked in from outside. He was alive. Barely, and not by much, but alive. Dana Kowalski stood in the cold outside that car and felt something she hadn't felt in 14 years on the job. Not relief. Something closer to dread. Because she understood, without anyone explaining it to her, that something had changed. Not in this man. Not in this street. In the drug itself. Last year, one dose was always enough. Now it wasn't. And nobody in any office or agency had yet put that fact into a report. Here is a number. 112,000. That is how many Americans died of drug overdoses in a single year. 2023. Not a decade. 1 year. To put that in proportion, the entire Vietnam War, across nearly 2 decades of American involvement, killed 58,000 US soldiers. The overdose death toll in 2023 was almost exactly double that. More Americans died of overdoses that year than from car accidents and gun violence combined. 2 causes of death that received billions of dollars in annual prevention funding, congressional hearings, presidential task forces, front-page coverage. The overdose crisis got all of those things too, and the number kept rising. Of those 112,000 deaths, more than 70% involved one specific substance. Not heroin, not cocaine, not methamphetamine, not any of the drugs that defined the American drug crisis for the previous 5 decades. Fentanyl, a drug that was invented in a quiet Belgian laboratory in 1959. A drug that spent its first 3 decades locked inside hospital operating rooms, administered only by trained anesthesiologists, used exclusively to keep patients unconscious during surgery. A drug that worked exactly as intended, that saved thousands of lives, that almost no one outside of medicine had ever heard of. That drug is now killing more Americans every year than any single cause of death has since the 1918 flu pandemic. The question is not simply how it escaped from those operating rooms. That part of the story, it turns out, is almost straightforward. The question that takes 2 hours to answer, the question that requires following a specific man through a specific American life, tracking a specific decision made by a specific company in 1995, and understanding a specific shift in the global drug trade that happened in a specific kitchen in Mexico around 2012, is something more disturbing. The question is, who let it? Dayton, Ohio did not become the overdose capital of America by accident. The city sits at a geographic intersection that drug traffickers have understood for longer than most public officials. It is within a day's drive of 60% of the US population, positioned at the crossing of two major interstate highways, surrounded by small towns where economic collapse had been quietly unfolding since the 1980s, and where doctors, for reasons that will become clear, had been particularly generous with pain prescriptions throughout the 1990s and 2000s. By 2016, Dayton had more overdose deaths per capita than any other city in the United States. The fire department had begun carrying naloxone on every truck. Not just ambulances, trucks. Dana Kowalski had watched this happen in real time. She had a legal pad in her locker at the station, not an official document, not a report, just a personal record, on which she'd been keeping a handwritten tally of overdose calls since 2010. By 2016, that pad had numbers on it that she found difficult to look at directly. The man in the silver Honda survived that November night. He was taken to Miami Valley Hospital, treated, and released 3 days later. His name does not appear in any public record connected to this story. He is one of the people who made it. But something Dana noticed that morning would take another 2 years, several DEA reports, and one congressional hearing to confirm officially. The amount of naloxone required to reverse an overdose had been quietly multiplying, not because the doses were weaker, but because the drug being overdosed on had grown stronger. Not just stronger, different. Something new had entered the supply, something that the original naloxone protocols had not been designed to handle, something that would eventually require emergency responders across the country to carry not one dose, not two, but sometimes 4 or 5. What that substance was, where it came from, and who made the decisions, across 6 decades and 3 continents, that allowed it to reach a man in a Honda Civic on a Dayton Street corner at 2:47 in the morning, is a story that begins not in a cartel warehouse, not in a dark web marketplace, not in the desperation of a single life gone wrong, but in a laboratory where a brilliant scientist was trying to solve a problem that had troubled surgeons for 100 years. He solved it, completely, elegantly, and 60 years later, his solution is the deadliest drug in American history. Paul Janssen was 29 years old when he started the company that would change the history of pain. The year was 1953. Beers was a small town in northern Belgium, flat, quiet, the kind of place where the loudest thing on most mornings was the wind moving through the fields. Janssen set up his first laboratory in the back of his father's pharmaceutical distribution business, in a space so modest that the entire operation fit inside a single room. He had a chemistry degree from the University of Ghent, a medical degree that he had completed in 4 years instead of the usual 7, and a specific obsession that most of his colleagues considered, at best, ambitious, and at worst, naive. He wanted to synthesize better versions of existing drugs. Not discover new molecules by accident, the way most pharmaceutical breakthroughs happened at the time, but engineer them deliberately, by understanding exactly how a compound interacted with the human body, and then improving that interaction, one chemical adjustment at a time. This was not how the pharmaceutical industry worked in 1953. It was in fact barely how it worked anywhere. Janssen didn't care. He hired a small team and began working. Within 5 years, his laboratory had produced more new pharmaceutical compounds than most major European drug companies generated in a decade. Janssen had a method. He would take a known molecule, map its effects with precision, identify exactly which part of its chemical structure produced the desired result, and then strip away everything else. Peel the molecule down to its essential mechanism, then make it cleaner, faster, more controllable. By 1960, he turned that method toward opioids. The problem with morphine in surgical settings was not that it failed. It worked, powerfully, reliably. The problem was that it worked too broadly and too slowly. Morphine floods the entire central nervous system, and it lingers. A patient given morphine before surgery might still have measurable amounts in their bloodstream 6, 8, 12 hours later. During that window, the drug continued to suppress the body's automatic functions, breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, at a time when surgeons needed those systems stable and responsive. Too much morphine and the patient's breathing slowed to a stop. Too little, and they woke up mid-procedure, their body in shock. The margin between those two outcomes was distressingly narrow, and anesthesiologists in the 1950s navigated it with a combination of training, experience, and something uncomfortably close to guesswork. Janssen's goal was to close that margin entirely. He spent 2 years working through a class of synthetic compounds called phenylpiperidines, a family of molecules with known opioid properties that had been partially explored but never fully mapped. He was looking for a compound that would bind tightly to the brain's opioid receptors, produce powerful analgesia, pain relief, and then leave the body quickly. Not slowly metabolized over hours. Gone. The kind of drug an anesthesiologist could control in real time, adjusting the dose during a procedure the way a musician adjusts volume during a performance. In 1960, he found it. The compound was R4263 in his laboratory's numbering system. Later, he gave it a proper name, fentanyl. The first tests were in animals. The results were striking enough that Janssen's team ran them twice to confirm. Fentanyl was not merely stronger than morphine. It was approximately 100 times more potent by weight, meaning a dose measured in micrograms, amounts so small they were invisible to the naked eye, produced analgesia that morphine could only achieve in doses measured in milligrams. And the critical detail, it cleared the body in minutes rather than hours, fast in, fast out, controllable in a way that morphine had never been. Janssen published his findings. The medical community did not immediately celebrate. The skepticism was understandable given the history. The previous century of opioid pharmacology had been a series of disasters dressed as breakthroughs. Morphine itself had been introduced in the 1800s as a safer alternative to opium. Heroin, diacetylmorphine, was synthesized in 1898 by the Bayer Corporation, the same company that made aspirin, and was marketed for 2 years as a non-addictive cough suppressant for children before the catastrophe of that claim became undeniable. Every generation had been handed a new opioid with assurances of safety, and every generation had eventually learned what the assurances missed. Fentanyl arrived into that history carrying a significant burden of proof. What distinguished it, ultimately, was the specificity of its application. Janssen's team was not proposing fentanyl as a general pain medication, not something to be handed out in pill form, not something patients would take home. The drug was designed exclusively for the controlled environment of an operating room, where every dose could be measured to the microgram, every patient vital sign monitored continuously, every adverse reaction addressed within seconds by trained personnel. It was a surgical instrument in chemical form. The FDA approved fentanyl for use in the United States in 1968. Its entry into clinical practice was immediate and transformative. Complex surgeries that had previously required careful, nerve-wracking management of morphine doses could now be performed with a level of anesthetic precision that had simply not existed before. Open-heart surgery, neurosurgery, long abdominal procedures requiring hours of stable unconsciousness. Fentanyl made each of them safer. For its first 2 decades in America, the drug did not have a single reported case of diversion to the street. Not one. It lived inside hospitals, behind locked cabinets, inside refrigerated storage units, in the hands of professionals who tracked every milliliter against written records. The most powerful opioid compound in clinical use, 100 times stronger than morphine, lethal in microgram quantities, and it stayed exactly where it was put. Paul Janssen did not stop after fentanyl. By the end of the 1960s, his laboratory had produced over 70 pharmaceutical compounds that reached clinical use, a number that remains almost without parallel in the history of private pharmaceutical research. Janssen Pharmaceutica, still headquartered in Beers, grew from that single backroom laboratory into one of the most productive drug development operations in the world. In 1961, it was acquired by Johnson & Johnson, at the time a relatively quiet deal that attracted little attention. The acquisition would matter enormously, for reasons that would not become clear for another 3 decades. Janssen himself continued working. He was the kind of scientist who found it genuinely difficult to stop. Colleagues later described him as someone who thought about chemistry the way other people thought about breathing, continuously and without effort. He was photographed in his laboratory well into his 70s, white-coated, surrounded by notebooks, still adjusting structures, still looking for the cleaner version. The drug he was most proud of sat in hospital cabinets across America, doing exactly what he designed it to do, keeping people unconscious during the worst hours of their lives, then releasing them back to consciousness with minimal trace. It was working perfectly. In 1990, 30 years after its synthesis and 22 years after its American approval, fentanyl had still never been reported on the street in any US city. Then, a doctor in Atlanta gave a presentation at a medical conference, and the longest pharmaceutical chain reaction in American history quietly began. The doctor's name was David Haddocks, and the paper he presented in 1989 introduced a concept that would, over the following decade, quietly dismantle the most important guardrail in American pain medicine. He called it pseudo-addiction. The idea was specific and, on its surface, compassionate. Haddocks argued that patients suffering from undertreated pain sometimes displayed behaviours that looked like addiction, demanding more medication, watching the clock until their next dose, becoming agitated or manipulative when doses were delayed, but that these behaviours were not signs of addiction at all. They were signs of desperation. They were what suffering looked like when the medical system failed to manage it adequately. The solution, Haddocks argued, was not to withhold medication from these patients. It was to give them more. The paper spread through pain medicine circles with unusual speed. It gave a name to something doctors had quietly worried about for years, the fear of undertreating pain, and it reframed that worry as the primary concern, not addiction, not dependency, undertreating. The paper did not prove its thesis with clinical data. It presented 2 case studies, but it arrived at precisely the moment the medical system was ready to hear it. The American Pain Society had been pushing since the mid-1980s for pain to be taken more seriously as a medical problem. In 1996, their president, Dr. James Campbell, delivered a speech that produced the single most consequential phrase in the history of the opioid crisis. Pain should be treated as the 5th vital sign. Alongside blood pressure, pulse, temperature, and breathing rate, the 4 measurements that defined a patient's condition, pain should be assessed on every visit, every admission, every clinical encounter. and like the other 4 vital signs, elevated pain should trigger a clinical response. The Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, the body that determined whether hospitals met federal standards, adopted this framework in 2001. Hospitals were now evaluated in part on how well they managed patient pain. Patient satisfaction surveys began, including questions about pain management. Those surveys were tied to hospital reimbursement rates. The financial incentive had arrived. Doctors who prescribed more pain medication received better patient reviews. Doctors who received better patient reviews kept their hospital privileges more easily. The system had been rewired without anyone explicitly deciding to rewire it to reward prescribing. Pharmaceutical companies had been watching all of this very carefully. By 1990, Janssen Pharmaceutica, now operating as a division of Johnson & Johnson, had been sitting on a significant problem. Fentanyl was enormously effective, but its market was fundamentally limited by its delivery mechanism. Injectable fentanyl required an IV line, a clinical setting, trained personnel. There was no way to sell it outside a hospital, and inside a hospital, purchasing decisions were made by committee, not by individual physicians responding to pharmaceutical sales pitches. The drug needed a new form, something that could be prescribed, something a patient could take home. The solution came from an unexpected direction: the skin. Researchers at Janssen discovered that fentanyl, unlike most opioids, could pass through the skin barrier and enter the bloodstream directly. Not quickly, slowly, steadily, over hours. A patch applied to the skin would release a controlled amount of fentanyl continuously for 72 hours, maintaining a stable blood concentration without requiring injections, without requiring a clinic, without requiring anything except a patient willing to place a small adhesive rectangle against their upper arm or chest. The patch was called Duragesic. The FDA approved it in 1990 for one specific population: cancer patients with chronic, severe pain who were already tolerant to opioids, who had tried other medications and found them insufficient, and who required around-the-clock pain management for their remaining months or years of life. The approval language was precise. The intended patient was a cancer patient, likely terminal, already on strong opioids. The sales strategy that followed did not stay inside those boundaries. By the mid-1990s, Janssen sales representatives were calling on general practitioners, family doctors, orthopedic surgeons and rheumatologists, physicians whose patients had chronic back pain, arthritis, fibromyalgia, and post-surgical discomfort. The representatives carried clinical literature emphasizing fentanyl's efficacy, and critically, its side effect profile relative to oral opioids. They carried starter coupons. Some carried branded merchandise, pens, notepads. In some offices, a small fentanyl patch-shaped pillow used as a desk toy, later cited in congressional testimony as evidence of the normalization campaign. The pitch was consistent across sales calls. Patients suffering from chronic non-cancer pain were undertreated. The pseudo-addiction framework had already established that idea in the clinical mainstream, and Duragesic offered a clean, steady solution. No pills to count, no peaks and valleys of pain and relief, just a patch, changed every 3 days, providing continuous comfort. Prescriptions climbed. First slowly, then not slowly. By 2000, Duragesic was generating over $1 billion annually for Johnson & Johnson. A significant portion of those prescriptions were going to patients for whom the drug was not approved. The off-label prescribing that was technically legal, but that the FDA's original approval had never envisioned. Each of those patients went home carrying enough fentanyl in a single patch to kill multiple people if that fentanyl were extracted and concentrated. The patches were not behind locked cabinets anymore. They were in bathroom medicine chests and kitchen drawers, in purses and nightstands in houses with teenagers and visiting relatives and neighbours who knew where the key was kept. The containment was over. It had ended not with a break-in, not with a theft, not with any single criminal act. It had ended with a prescription pad and a sales visit and a concept invented by a doctor at a conference. The first confirmed reports of duragesic patch diversion reached the DEA in 1994. Users in California had discovered that the gel inside the patch, a reservoir design used in early versions, could be extracted by cutting the patch open. The gel contained a concentrated fentanyl solution. Some users were swallowing it. Some were applying it directly to mucous membranes for faster absorption. Some, most dangerously, were injecting it, taking a substance designed for slow transdermal release and forcing it into the bloodstream all at once, producing a hit of staggering and wildly unpredictable intensity. Overdose deaths linked to patch diversion began appearing in medical examiner reports in Florida, Texas, and Ohio. The numbers were small enough that they didn't trigger federal alarm. The DEA noted the reports and continued monitoring. Janssen reformulated the patch in the early 2000s, replacing the extractable gel reservoir with a matrix design. Fentanyl embedded directly into the adhesive material, making extraction significantly harder. The reformulation reduced but did not eliminate diversion. Users adapted. Some were now cutting patches into small pieces and placing them under their tongues. Some were heating the matrix patches to accelerate release. One method involved chewing directly through the patch material, a practice so dangerous that the FDA issued a specific public warning about it in 2005 after several deaths. By the time those warnings were issued, something far larger had already begun. Fentanyl patches were one thread in a fabric that was rapidly expanding. Because in 1996, the same year Dr. Campbell gave his fifth vital sign speech, a different pharmaceutical company made a different decision that would create the largest population of opioid-dependent Americans in the country's history. And that population would eventually need somewhere to go when their prescriptions were taken away. That company was Purdue Pharma. That drug was OxyContin. And the interaction between those two forces, the slow burn of fentanyl patches spreading through suburban medicine cabinets, and the fast explosion of OxyContin flooding every county in America, would produce a human landscape that neither crisis, separately, could have created alone. It was 1996. Marcus Webb was 3 years old. He was growing up in a town called Chillicothe, 40 miles south of Columbus, in a county where the economy had been hollowing out since the paper mill closed in 1987. The town had a Walmart, a Dollar General, 2 churches per square mile, and a pain clinic that had opened on Route 50 the previous year. Nobody in Chillicothe had heard of fentanyl. Almost nobody had heard of OxyContin either. That was about to change in ways the town had no framework to prepare for. Marcus Webb grew up knowing how to work with his hands. His father had been a pipe fitter at the Mead paper mill until the mill closed, then a seasonal roofer, then a man who woke up at 5 in the morning out of habit even after there was nowhere to be. The house on Delano Avenue had a porch that sagged on the left side and a furnace that made a sound in February like something trapped inside the walls. Marcus learned to fix both before he was 16. He wasn't exceptional in school, not failing, not excelling, just present, the kind of student teachers remembered as quiet and reliable. He had a younger sister named Carla who was sharper than he was, and who he protected with a ferocity that surprised people who assumed he was simply easygoing. He graduated in 2001. He got a job framing houses with a crew out of Circleville, 40 minutes up Route 23. The work suited him. Physical, concrete, measurable. At the end of each day there was something standing that hadn't been there in the morning, and he had built it. He was 20 years old and earning $14 an hour, which in Chillicothe in 2001 was enough to rent a one-bedroom on Paint Street and still have something left. This was ordinary life. Not glamorous, not desperate. Just a young man building houses and coming home tired and watching the Ohio State game on a second-hand television on Saturday afternoons. He had no idea what was moving toward him. OxyContin had arrived in Ross County, the county containing Chillicothe, like it arrived everywhere in rural Appalachian Ohio, through doctors' offices, through word of mouth, through the specific and particular misery of physical labor performed in aging bodies without adequate insurance. Purdue Pharma's sales representatives had covered Ross County the way they covered every county in the region, tracking physician prescription rates with spreadsheet precision, rewarding high-prescribing doctors with dinners and conference invitations, identifying which medical practices had the highest concentration of patients with chronic pain, and targeting those practices with a focus that a former Purdue sales rep would later describe to a Senate committee as surgical. The drug had been marketed on a single central claim. Its extended-release formulation meant the opioid was delivered slowly enough that it didn't produce the euphoric rush associated with addiction. That claim had one significant problem. It wasn't true. When OxyContin tablets were crushed, a discovery that spread through certain populations with extraordinary speed, the time-release mechanism was destroyed entirely and the full dose hit the brain at once. Purdue Pharma's own internal research showed the company knew this was happening by 1999. They continued marketing the drug as non-addictive until 2007, when they pleaded guilty to federal charges of misbranding and paid $600 million in fines. $600 million. The drug had generated $35 billion in revenue by that point. In Chillicothe, none of those numbers meant anything yet. What meant something was that a man with a bad back who had been told to take ibuprofen and rest was now being handed a prescription for a drug that eliminated his pain completely, and also, this was the part that was difficult to convey clinically, but that spread person to person through any community faster than any pharmaceutical marketing campaign, made everything feel bearable, not just the pain in his back, everything. That is the piece that does not appear in congressional testimony or FDA approval documents or medical journal abstracts. It requires sitting inside the experience to understand, and the experience is this. The human brain contains opioid receptors that exist in their natural state to respond to the body's own endorphins, the molecules released during intense exercise, during physical pleasure, during the specific biochemical warmth of being held by someone who loves you. Opioid drugs bind to these same receptors with a force that no natural stimulus can match. The effect is not merely the absence of pain, it is the presence of something that the brain interprets as profound safety, profound relief, profound okayness, a sensation that many people, particularly people carrying the accumulated weight of difficult lives, have never felt so fully before. The brain registers this, files it. The neural pathway that led to that feeling gets reinforced, becomes a groove, becomes a pull. When the drug leaves the bloodstream, it takes that feeling with it entirely, and the absence is not neutral. The absence feels like subtraction, like something essential has been removed from the operating system of normal functioning. This is not weakness. This is the specific mechanism by which opioids interact with the specific architecture of the human brain. It works this way in everyone. Marcus Webb tore the cartilage in his right knee in the spring of 2003, falling from scaffolding on a job site in Circleville. The fall was 4 feet. He hit a concrete foundation pad at the wrong angle, felt something inside his knee shift with a sensation he described to his sister afterward as a door hinge breaking. He was driven to Adena Regional Medical Center, where they confirmed a torn meniscus and partial ACL damage, recommended surgery, and before he left the examination room gave him a prescription for OxyContin. He filled it at the Kroger pharmacy on Bridge Street, took the first pill in the parking lot because his knee was still producing a specific pulsing agony that made it difficult to sit still. Within 40 minutes the pain was gone, not managed, not reduced, gone. And in its place, spreading outward from somewhere in the centre of his chest, was a warmth that he would spend the next 16 years of his life trying to find again. The surgery went well. The surgeon was satisfied with the repair. The standard protocol at the time, this was 2003, 3 years before any meaningful prescribing guidelines were revised, called for post-surgical pain management with OxyContin for the recovery period, then a taper to a lower dose opioid, then discontinuation. The recovery period was estimated at 8 to 12 weeks. At the end of 12 weeks, Marcus Webb's knee was healing correctly, but his prescription was not discontinued. His follow-up appointments continued. His pain, he reported, was persistent. A different doctor at the same practice renewed the prescription without reviewing the original surgeon's notes. This was not unusual. In 2003 in Ross County, Ohio, it was common. By the time Marcus was back on the job site in late 2003, he'd been taking OxyContin daily for 7 months. He hadn't noticed it becoming necessary. That was the word he used to his sister much later. Not addicted, not dependent, just necessary, like the word people use for things they cannot imagine removing from their daily structure. He woke up in the morning and took a pill and felt normal. On the days he miscounted and ran short, he felt a specific grinding restlessness by early afternoon. Not pain exactly, more like the absence of his own baseline, like the volume on everything had been turned up 3 notches too high. He told himself he would deal with it after the next job. Meanwhile, 20 miles northeast of Chillicothe, the Ross County Pain Clinic on Route 50 had expanded. A second location had opened in Waverly. A local pharmacist had begun noticing that the same patients were filling OxyContin prescriptions at multiple pharmacies across 2 counties, a practice that would later be called doctor shopping, but the reporting system that should have flagged this to physicians and law enforcement was not yet operational in Ohio. It would not become operational until 2006. By then, the window that mattered most had already closed. The Duragesic patch existed in this same landscape, flowing through different channels into the same communities. By 2003, Ross County physicians had written enough fentanyl patch prescriptions that the local drug court judge, a man who had been on the bench for 11 years and who had processed hundreds of OxyContin cases, later told an Ohio state commission that he had not been aware fentanyl patches were a street drug problem in his county until 2004, when 3 overdose cases in 6 months all involved extracted patch gel. The patches and the pills occupied different social strata, at least at first. OxyContin was the suburban and rural pill mill drug, flowing from doctors' offices in mass quantities. The patches were quieter, more associated with legitimate chronic pain patients whose prescriptions were being diverted by family members, stolen from medicine cabinets, sold in parking lots for $20 apiece. What connected both streams was their destination, the same population of people whose opioid receptors had been thoroughly remodeled by years of prescription exposure, who could no longer feel normal without a chemical that bound to those receptors, and who, when their prescriptions were eventually cut off, as they would be systematically in the years ahead, would need to find that molecule somewhere else. The pharmaceutical companies had spent a decade building that population. They had not spent a single dollar thinking about what would happen next. In a city of 4 million people on the other side of the planet, in the Zhejiang province of China, a group of chemists who had never heard of Chillicothe or OxyContin or Marcus Webb were working on something that would answer that question for them. working through a catalogue of compounds structurally related to Paul Janssen's original molecule, synthesizing variants, testing potencies, preparing to ship products to any country in the world that would buy them, through a postal system that had no mechanism to detect what was inside a package labelled as research chemicals. They were not hiding. They had a website. They listed their products and prices in English. Nobody was looking yet. The DEA report landed on a desk in Washington in the spring of 2006, and the people who read it used a word that does not appear often in federal law enforcement documents: unprecedented. In a 6-month window between April and October of 2005, more than 1,000 people had died of opioid overdoses across Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia. The deaths shared a specific toxicological signature: not OxyContin, not prescription fentanyl, not heroin alone. The medical examiners found fentanyl in concentrations that no pharmaceutical patch or legitimate prescription could explain. Someone had manufactured it. Someone had mixed it into the heroin supply in 3 major American cities without any of those cities' law enforcement agencies detecting the source, the distribution network, or even the presence of fentanyl in the supply, until bodies began accumulating at a rate that overwhelmed county morgues. The DEA traced the source to a single clandestine laboratory operating out of a house in Toluca, Mexico, 60 miles west of Mexico City. 2 men were running it. One was a trained chemist. The lab was not large. The entire operation fit inside 2 rooms, but it had produced enough fentanyl-laced heroin to kill 1,000 people across 3 cities before anyone found it. The lab was shut down in late 2006. Mexican authorities made arrests. The overdose deaths in Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia dropped sharply within weeks, almost immediately, with a directness that confirmed just how completely one small operation had been responsible. The DEA issued a public statement describing the threat as contained. They believed it. That was not a lie or a cover-up or a political calculation. Based on the evidence available in late 2006, the threat genuinely appeared contained. The lab was gone. The supply had stopped. The death rate had fallen. What no one in that assessment had accounted for was the lesson. Marcus Webb's prescription ended not with a doctor's decision, but with a DEA audit. In March of 2007, federal agents executed search warrants on 4 pain clinics in Ross and Pike counties, including the clinic on Route 50 that had been renewing Webb's OxyContin prescription for nearly 4 years. The investigation had been building for 18 months, triggered by pharmacy flagging data showing that the clinic's prescribing rates were 7 times the state average for oxycodone. The clinic's primary physician was indicted on 43 counts of illegal distribution of controlled substances. The clinic closed the same day the warrant was served. Webb found out through a phone call from the clinic's receptionist, who was calling every patient on the roster to inform them that the practice was no longer operating. She read from a prepared statement. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. He sat with that information for the rest of the afternoon. His knee had long since healed. The structural damage repaired during his 2003 surgery had been stable for years, confirmed by imaging at a follow-up appointment in 2005. He no longer had a medical reason for the prescription, had not had one technically for some time. What he had instead was a body that had reorganized itself around a daily opioid intake so thoroughly that the absence of it, by the second day, produced a specific constellation of sensations that are worth describing precisely. Skin that registered ordinary air contact as abrasion, a digestive system in open revolt, leg muscles that cramped without warning, and behind all of it, underneath all of it, an anxiety so total and sourceless that it felt less like an emotion and more like a change in the composition of the atmosphere. This is opioid withdrawal. It is not fatal in healthy adults. It feels to the person experiencing it as though it might be. He lasted 4 days before he called a number someone at the job site had mentioned 6 months earlier, in the context of a conversation he had not paid particular attention to at the time. The number connected him to a man in Chillicothe who sold OxyContin pills individually, 40 milligrams each, $30 apiece. Webb bought 3. The relief was so immediate, so complete, so chemically indistinguishable from the first time he had taken the drug in the Kroger parking lot 4 years earlier, that the preceding 4 days collapsed into a memory that felt almost theoretical. The individual pill market lasted another 8 months before it too dried up. Crackdowns on pill mills across southern Ohio were removing enormous quantities of prescription opioids from the supply chain, which should have been straightforwardly good news. The problem was purely economic. As legitimate prescription pills became scarcer on the street, their price rose. $30 became $50, $50 became $80. A daily habit that had cost $20 when prescriptions were easy had become a $100 a day problem, in a county where the median household income was $38,000 a year. Heroin did not have a supply problem. It did not have a price problem either. In 2008, a bag of heroin in Chillicothe cost $8. Webb made the transition on a Tuesday in November 2008 in the parking lot of a laundromat on North Bridge Street. The man who sold it to him was someone he had known peripherally for years. Not a stranger, not a cartel operative, not a figure from any law enforcement narrative about drug distribution. Just a person who had found a supply in a market and connected them. The heroin worked. Of course it worked. It was the same family of molecule binding to the same receptors, producing the same profound neurological relief. Webb told himself he would use it only until he could find a way to stabilize, until he could get into a treatment program, until the waiting list at the county's single addiction treatment facility cleared, until something changed. The waiting list was 4 months long. Donna Kowalski responded to her first confirmed fentanyl-related overdose in October 2007 on Xenia Avenue in Dayton, 45 miles north of Chillicothe. She did not know it was fentanyl. The call presented identically to every other opioid overdose she'd worked. Unresponsive adult, shallow breathing, pinpoint pupils. She administered naloxone. The patient responded, standard outcome. The toxicology report came back 3 weeks later and went to the Dayton Fire Department's medical director, not to Kowalski directly. She only learned the result when a colleague mentioned it in passing during a shift change. The report had flagged fentanyl at a concentration inconsistent with any prescribed dose, meaning the fentanyl had come from somewhere outside the pharmaceutical supply chain. She made a note of it in her personal log and flagged it to her supervisor. Her supervisor forwarded it to the county health department. The county health department added it to a quarterly report that would not be compiled and distributed for another 4 months. 4 months. In those 4 months, Dana Kowalski responded to 11 more overdoses in the same neighborhood. She did not yet know how many of them involved the same substance, because the toxicology pipeline moved at the speed of bureaucracy, while the drug supply moved at the speed of commerce. What was moving through the heroin supply in Dayton in 2007 was not yet the industrial-scale fentanyl contamination that would define the crisis a decade later. It was early, experimental, individual dealers acquiring small quantities, some from diverted patches, some from sources that toxicology labs were still working to identify, and mixing them into heroin batches to increase potency without increasing cost. A few grams of fentanyl could stretch a heroin supply significantly. The economics were straightforward. The lethality of the miscalculation. Too much fentanyl in one portion of a batch, not enough mixing, a hot spot that one buyer got and another didn't, was not immediately apparent to anyone making those calculations. The word fentanyl did not appear in the Dayton Daily News until 2013. 3,000 miles away from Dayton, in the Zhejiang province of China, a chemical company called Yuancheng Group was operating openly, with a registered business address, a functioning website offering dozens of fentanyl analog compounds for sale, prices listed in US dollars, and a customer service email that responded within 24 hours. Their products were not illegal under Chinese law, which did not schedule most synthetic opioid analogues until 2015. Their shipping records, later obtained through international law enforcement cooperation, showed packages destined for addresses in Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and 31 other US states. The packages moved through the US Postal Service. They were labelled as research chemicals, as industrial compounds, as cleaning supplies. Customs agents intercepted a fraction of them, a fraction so small that the agency's own internal estimates, released years later through a Senate investigation, suggested that seizures represented somewhere between 2 and 8% of total volume. 2 to 8%. The other 92 to 98% arrived at their destinations. Some went to dealers who mixed the compounds into street heroin. Some went directly to individual users who had found Yuancheng's website the same way anyone finds anything in 2009. Through a search engine, on a laptop, in a house in a zip code that no law enforcement profile of the fentanyl crisis had yet identified as a risk zone. This was the architecture of the next phase, and it was already fully operational before the first congressional hearing on prescription opioids had even been scheduled. Marcus Webb did not know about Zhejiang province. He did not know about Yuancheng Group. He knew that the heroin he bought in the laundromat parking lot on Tuesdays cost $8, that it worked, and that he needed it every day or the world became a physical emergency. He knew one other thing, though he hadn't yet put language to it. The batches were getting stronger. Not consistently, unpredictably. Some weeks were the same as always. Some weeks, a quantity that had been completely manageable left him on the floor of his bathroom, conscious but unable to move, watching the light under the door and waiting to find out which direction the next hour would go. He started using with a friend named Derek, a man from the job site 2 years younger, who had arrived at the same substance through a different prescription for a different injury. Using with someone else was a practical calculation. If one of them went down, the other could call. It was the closest thing to a safety system available to them. It was inadequate, but it was something, and in a county with one treatment facility, a 4-month waiting list, no needle exchange, and a law that still classified naloxone as a prescription-only medication, meaning Dana Kowalski had it on her rig, but Webb could not carry it himself. Something was all there was. The year was 2009, the OxyContin reformulation that would shatter the existing street supply and send millions of opioid-dependent Americans searching for alternatives was 12 months away. What came after that reformulation would make everything that had happened so far look like a warning that nobody read. The DEA report landed on a desk in Washington in the spring of 2006, and the people who read it used a word that does not appear often in federal law enforcement documents: unprecedented. In a 6-month window between April and October of 2005, more than 1,000 people had died of opioid overdoses across Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia. The deaths shared a specific toxicological signature, not OxyContin, not prescription fentanyl, not heroin alone. The medical examiners found fentanyl in concentrations that no pharmaceutical patch or legitimate prescription could explain. Someone had manufactured it. Someone had mixed it into the heroin supply in 3 major American cities, without any of those cities' law enforcement agencies detecting the source, the distribution network, or even the presence of fentanyl in the supply until bodies began accumulating at a rate that overwhelmed county morgues. The DEA traced the source to a single clandestine laboratory operating out of a house in Toluca, Mexico, 60 miles west of Mexico City. 2 men were running it. One was a trained chemist. The lab was not large. The entire operation fit inside 2 rooms, but it had produced enough fentanyl-laced heroin to kill 1,000 people across 3 cities before anyone found it. The lab was shut down in late 2006. Mexican authorities made arrests. The overdose deaths in Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia dropped sharply within weeks, almost immediately, with a directness that confirmed just how completely one small operation had been responsible. The DEA issued a public statement describing the threat as contained. They believed it. That was not a lie or a cover-up or a political calculation. Based on the evidence available in late 2006, the threat genuinely appeared contained. The lab was gone. The supply had stopped. The death rate had fallen. What no one in that assessment had accounted for was the lesson. Marcus Webb's prescription ended not with a doctor's decision, but with a DEA audit. In March of 2007, federal agents executed search warrants on 4 pain clinics in Ross and Pike counties, including the clinic on Route 50 that had been renewing Webb's OxyContin prescription for nearly 4 years. The investigation had been building for 18 months, triggered by pharmacy flagging data showing that the clinic's prescribing rates were 7 times the state average for oxycodone. The clinic's primary physician was indicted on 43 counts of illegal distribution of controlled substances. The clinic closed the same day the warrant was served. Webb found out through a phone call from the clinic's receptionist, who was calling every patient on the roster to inform them that the practice was no longer operating. She read from a prepared statement. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. He sat with that information for the rest of the afternoon. His knee had long since healed. The structural damage repaired during his 2003 surgery had been stable for years, confirmed by imaging at a follow-up appointment in 2005. He no longer had a medical reason for the prescription, had not had one technically for some time. What he had instead was a body that had reorganized itself around a daily opioid intake so thoroughly that the absence of it, by the second day, produced a specific constellation of sensations that are worth describing precisely. Skin that registered ordinary air contact as abrasion, a digestive system in open revolt, leg muscles that cramped without warning, and behind all of it, underneath all of it, an anxiety so total and sourceless that it felt less like an emotion and more like a change in the composition of the atmosphere. This is opioid withdrawal. It is not fatal in healthy adults. It feels to the person experiencing it as though it might be. He lasted 4 days before he called a number someone at the job site had mentioned 6 months earlier, in the context of a conversation he had not paid particular attention to at the time. The number connected him to a man in Chillicothe who sold OxyContin pills individually, 40 milligrams each, $30 apiece. Webb bought 3. The relief was so immediate, so complete, so chemically indistinguishable from the first time he had taken the drug in the Kroger parking lot 4 years earlier, that the preceding 4 days collapsed into a memory that felt almost theoretical. The individual pill market lasted another 8 months before it too dried up. Crackdowns on pill mills across southern Ohio were removing enormous quantities of prescription opioids from the supply chain, which should have been straightforwardly good news. The problem was purely economic. As legitimate prescription pills became scarcer on the street, their price rose. $30 became $50, $50 became $80. A daily habit that had cost $20 when prescriptions were easy had become a $100 a day problem, in a county where the median household income was $38,000 a year. Heroin did not have a supply problem. It did not have a price problem either. In 2008, a bag of heroin in Chillicothe cost $8. Webb made the transition on a Tuesday in November 2008 in the parking lot of a laundromat on North Bridge Street. The man who sold it to him was someone he had known peripherally for years. Not a stranger, not a cartel operative, not a figure from any law enforcement narrative about drug distribution. Just a person who had found a supply in a market and connected them. The heroin worked. Of course it worked. It was the same family of molecule binding to the same receptors, producing the same profound neurological relief. Webb told himself he would use it only until he could find a way to stabilize, until he could get into a treatment program, until the waiting list at the county's single addiction treatment facility cleared, until something changed. The waiting list was 4 months long. Donna Kowalski responded to her first confirmed fentanyl-related overdose in October 2007 on Xenia Avenue in Dayton, 45 miles north of Chillicothe. She did not know it was fentanyl. The call presented identically to every other opioid overdose she'd worked. Unresponsive adult, shallow breathing, pinpoint pupils. She administered naloxone. The patient responded, standard outcome. The toxicology report came back 3 weeks later and went to the Dayton Fire Department's medical director, not to Kowalski directly. She only learned the result when a colleague mentioned it in passing during a shift change. The report had flagged fentanyl at a concentration inconsistent with any prescribed dose, meaning the fentanyl had come from somewhere outside the pharmaceutical supply chain. She made a note of it in her personal log and flagged it to her supervisor. Her supervisor forwarded it to the county health department. The county health department added it to a quarterly report that would not be compiled and distributed for another 4 months. 4 months. In those 4 months, Dana Kowalski responded to 11 more overdoses in the same neighborhood. She did not yet know how many of them involved the same substance, because the toxicology pipeline moved at the speed of bureaucracy, while the drug supply moved at the speed of commerce. What was moving through the heroin supply in Dayton in 2007 was not yet the industrial-scale fentanyl contamination that would define the crisis a decade later. It was early, experimental, individual dealers acquiring small quantities, some from diverted patches, some from sources that toxicology labs were still working to identify, and mixing them into heroin batches to increase potency without increasing cost. A few grams of fentanyl could stretch a heroin supply significantly. The economics were straightforward. The lethality of the miscalculation. Too much fentanyl in one portion of a batch, not enough mixing, a hot spot that one buyer got and another didn't, was not immediately apparent to anyone making those calculations. The word fentanyl did not appear in the Dayton Daily News until 2013. 3,000 miles away from Dayton, in the Zhejiang province of China, a chemical company called Yuancheng Group was operating openly, with a registered business address, a functioning website offering dozens of fentanyl analog compounds for sale, prices listed in US dollars, and a customer service email that responded within 24 hours. Their products were not illegal under Chinese law, which did not schedule most synthetic opioid analogues until 2015. Their shipping records, later obtained through international law enforcement cooperation, showed packages destined for addresses in Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and 31 other US states. The packages moved through the US Postal Service. They were labelled as research chemicals, as industrial compounds, as cleaning supplies. Customs agents intercepted a fraction of them, a fraction so small that the agency's own internal estimates, released years later through a Senate investigation, suggested that seizures represented somewhere between 2 and 8% of total volume. 2 to 8%. The other 92 to 98% arrived at their destinations. Some went to dealers who mixed the compounds into street heroin. Some went directly to individual users who had found Yuan Cheng's website the same way anyone finds anything in 2009. Through a search engine, on a laptop, in a house in a zip code that no law enforcement profile of the fentanyl crisis had yet identified as a risk zone. This was the architecture of the next phase, and it was already fully operational before the first congressional hearing on prescription opioids had even been scheduled. Marcus Webb did not know about Zhejiang province. He did not know about Yuan Cheng Group. He knew that the heroin he bought in the laundromat parking lot on Tuesdays cost $8, that it worked, and that he needed it every day or the world became a physical emergency. He knew one other thing, though he hadn't yet put language to it. The batches were getting stronger. Not consistently, unpredictably. Some weeks were the same as always. Some weeks, a quantity that had been completely manageable left him on the floor of his bathroom, conscious but unable to move, watching the light under the door and waiting to find out which direction the next hour would go. He started using with a friend named Derek, a man from the job site 2 years younger, who had arrived at the same substance through a different prescription for a different injury. Using with someone else was a practical calculation. If one of them went down, the other could call. It was the closest thing to a safety system available to them. It was inadequate, but it was something, and in a county with one treatment facility, a 4-month waiting list, no needle exchange, and a law that still classified naloxone as a prescription-only medication, meaning Dana Kowalski had it on her rig, but Webb could not carry it himself. Something was all there was. The year was 2009, the OxyContin reformulation that would shatter the existing street supply and send millions of opioid-dependent Americans searching for alternatives was 12 months away. What came after that reformulation would make everything that had happened so far look like a warning that nobody read. The new OxyContin hit pharmacy shelves in August 2010, and within 72 hours word had moved through every street-level opioid network in the country, with a speed that no public health communication had ever achieved. The pill didn't crush anymore. Purdue Pharma had reformulated OxyContin using a polymer technology that transformed the tablet when subjected to any mechanical force into a dense, rubbery mass that could not be powdered, could not be dissolved cleanly, could not be prepared for injection. The FDA had approved the reformulation specifically as an abuse deterrent measure, and by the narrow technical standard of preventing the original method of misuse, it worked. Crushing OxyContin was now pointless. What the FDA's approval process had not formally modelled, though internal documents later suggested some officials had raised the concern, was the behavioural response of the approximately 2 million Americans who had been using OxyContin non-medically and who now needed an alternative. The reformulation did not treat their dependency. It did not connect them to treatment. It did not increase the availability of addiction medicine services or expand Medicaid coverage for rehabilitation. It changed the pill, and it left everything else exactly as it was. The pivot to heroin was not gradual. It was a market correction. Studies published in the years following the reformulation documented the shift with a precision that was almost clinical in its starkness. A 2012 paper in the New England Journal of Medicine surveyed people in treatment for opioid addiction and found that among those who had previously used OxyContin non-medically, 66% reported switching to heroin after the reformulation, not eventually, quickly. The most commonly cited reason was not preference, it was price and availability. Heroin was cheaper, more accessible, and produced by a supply chain that the reformulation had not touched. Heroin traffickers had not anticipated the reformulation specifically, but they were positioned to respond to it. Supply chains into the Midwest and Appalachia, already established through a decade of gradual market development, scaled upward to meet demand that arrived suddenly and in volume. In cities like Dayton, Columbus, and Cincinnati, wholesale heroin prices dropped between 2010 and 2012 as supply outpaced even the expanded demand. The economics of the street were operating with the same responsiveness as any legal commodity market. And somewhere inside that expanding heroin supply, moving in quantities too small for any visual inspection to detect, fentanyl was already spreading. The Sinaloa cartel's leadership understood the mathematics of fentanyl before most American law enforcement agencies had begun to grasp them. The calculation was not complex, but its implications were transformative. A single kilogram of black tar heroin, the product that had supplied the American Midwest for decades, required cultivating opium poppies across acres of Mexican farmland, harvesting the raw opium at a specific seasonal window, processing it through a multi-stage chemical reduction, packaging it, and moving it through a smuggling infrastructure that involved dozens of people across multiple border points. The profit margin on a kilogram of heroin from field to American street was significant, but bounded by all of those inputs. Fentanyl required none of the agricultural infrastructure. The precursor chemicals, primarily 4-ANPP and NPP, industrial compounds with legitimate manufacturing uses, could be sourced from chemical suppliers, increasingly from Chinese manufacturers who asked no questions about end use. A trained chemist with basic laboratory equipment could synthesize fentanyl from those precursors in a kitchen. The entire production process for a kilogram of fentanyl fit inside a space smaller than a studio apartment. And because fentanyl was 100 times more potent than heroin by weight, 1 kilogram of fentanyl had the street equivalency of 100 kilograms of heroin. 1 kilogram. A shoebox. 100 kilograms of effective product. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, moved into fentanyl production aggressively around 2012, establishing synthesis operations in Jalisco State that were structurally invisible compared to traditional drug manufacturing. No fields, no seasonal vulnerability, no weather dependency. The DEA's existing surveillance infrastructure, built around monitoring poppy cultivation and heroin processing facilities, identifiable by satellite imagery, had no analogue for a drug being cooked in a residential kitchen. The cartels did not initially replace heroin with fentanyl. They cut it. Small quantities of fentanyl mixed into heroin batches stretch supply without increasing bulk, reduce shipping weight, and increase the potency of the product in a way that street-level buyers noticed and in many cases sought out. A batch with fentanyl hit harder. In a market where buyers had no consumer protection and no quality control, harder often meant better, right up until it meant fatal. Marcus Webb noticed the change in the supply around the winter of 2013. He had been using heroin for 5 years by then. The rhythm of his life had reorganized itself around it in ways that had happened so incrementally that he had never experienced a single moment of recognizing the reorganization as it occurred. He woke up early because the gap between his last dose and morning had stretched long enough that sleep became difficult past 4 or 5 in the morning. He worked, still construction, though with a different crew, shorter contracts, less reliability, in the hours when he felt functional. He managed the day in segments, each one anchored to a timeline that had nothing to do with job sites or meals, or any of the structures that had organized his earlier life. He was 30 years old. He weighed 147 pounds. He had weighed 178 pounds at 22. The winter of 2013 brought a batch that was different. Not in appearance, same colour, same smell, same packaging, different in effect. He used his standard amount and felt it hit before he had even finished the process of administering it. A wave of intensity so far beyond the expected ceiling that his body's first response was alarm rather than relief. He sat very still for several minutes, paying close attention to his breathing, waiting to see what would happen next. He was still there the next morning. Derek was not always so fortunate. 3 weeks later, Derek went unresponsive in his apartment on Hickory Street and was found 6 hours later by his landlord, who had come to collect rent. He survived, but only because the overdose had been partial, enough to render him unconscious, not enough to stop his breathing entirely. Webb went to see him in the hospital. He sat in the chair beside the bed for 2 hours without speaking. Then he left and used on the drive home because his hands were shaking badly enough by then that he had pulled over on Route 50 to manage the withdrawal and, while pulled over, made the calculation that he already understood was not really a calculation at all. Dana Kowalski's handwritten tally told a story that the official reporting systems were still assembling in quarterly increments. By the end of 2014, she'd recorded 112 overdose responses personally, in a single year, in a single city, on a single shift rotation. The previous record, set in 2012, had been 67. She'd started carrying a second naloxone kit in her personal vehicle after the third time in a month that her rig had run low mid-shift. The department had not issued the second kit. She had purchased it herself, which required a prescription under Ohio law at the time, a prescription for a drug used to reverse overdoses, requiring a doctor's authorization for a paramedic to carry it off duty. The detail that she found difficult to explain to people who had not stood on those streets was this: the overdoses were not clustered in the places that people imagined. They were happening in Walmart parking lots and public library bathrooms, and the front seats of cars parked outside children's soccer games. The geographic footprint of the crisis had expanded far beyond any neighborhood that a resident of Dayton might have thought to avoid. It was everywhere, distributed, present in every zip code, every demographic corridor, every institution. In 2014, Montgomery County, the county containing Dayton, recorded more overdose deaths than homicides, suicides, and car accident fatalities combined. The number was so disproportionate that the county health commissioner sent it to the state health department with a cover letter asking for clarification, wondering if there had been a data error. There had been no error. The thing about fentanyl in the heroin supply was that no one buying heroin knew it was there. This was not metaphorical invisibility. Fentanyl is odorless, colourless, present in quantities so small, micrograms per dose, that it is physically undetectable by sight, smell or touch. A kilogram of heroin cut with 2 grams of fentanyl looked and smelled and felt identical to a kilogram of uncut heroin. The only way to detect it was chemical analysis, a laboratory test or a reagent strip designed to react to fentanyl's specific molecular structure. Those strips existed. They had been developed for harm reduction purposes in the 1990s. They cost less than $1 each. They were, in 2014, classified as drug paraphernalia under the laws of 37 states, meaning that possessing one was a criminal offence in the same legal category as possessing drug equipment. A person who wanted to know whether their heroin contained fentanyl was, in most of America, committing a crime by checking. The strips were available to researchers, to law enforcement laboratories, to the DEA forensic chemists who were building in 2014 and 2015 an increasingly detailed map of fentanyl's geographic spread through the American drug supply, a map that showed contamination in 41 states by the end of 2015, a map that one senior DEA analyst described in internal correspondence as looking like a weather system, moving, expanding, impossible to contain from the outside. That map existed in 2015. It was classified. It was not shared with county health departments. It was not shared with paramedics. Dana Kowalski, administering her second dose of naloxone to a man on a Dayton Street corner in 2015, did not have access to it. Marcus Webb, buying from a source he had used for 2 years and trusting the consistency of the supply, did not have access to it. Nobody on Salem Avenue had access to it. The map showed what was coming, and what was coming had a name that most Americans had never encountered, but that was about to appear in toxicology reports across the country, with a frequency that would make fentanyl itself look, in retrospect, like a manageable problem. Carfentanil, an opioid developed in the 1970s for one specific purpose: sedating elephants, 10,000 times more potent than morphine, 100 times more potent than fentanyl, detectable in quantities measured in nanograms, billionths of a gram, a quantity invisible to any instrument except a laboratory spectrometer, had just begun appearing in street supply samples collected by DEA field offices in Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia. The date was July 2016. Nobody issued a public warning for another 6 weeks. The congressional hearing in September 2017 was titled "Fentanyl, the Next Wave of the Opioid Crisis," and the framing of that title revealed precisely how far official understanding had fallen behind reality. Not the next wave, the current one, already broken, already receding over bodies. The hearing featured maps, charts, mortality projections, and testimony from DEA administrators who used the word unprecedented with enough frequency that it lost meaning by the third hour. Senators asked questions that demonstrated with painful clarity that many of them were encountering the specific mechanics of fentanyl distribution for the first time. One senator asked whether fentanyl was being manufactured in American laboratories. The DEA witness paused before answering, not for dramatic effect, but because the accurate answer required dismantling an assumption so fundamental to the question that correcting it would take several minutes. The assumption was this: that fentanyl was a cartel product, moving north through the same border corridors that had carried heroin and cocaine for decades, interdicted through the same border enforcement infrastructure, subject to the same supply chain vulnerabilities that made traditional drug trafficking susceptible to law enforcement pressure. That assumption was wrong, and the reason it was wrong would change everything about how the crisis needed to be understood. The DEA's Forensic Intelligence Division had spent 18 months building a sourcing analysis that its own analysts described, in internal communications, as a result they had not expected to find. The analysis tracked seized fentanyl samples from 43 states, matched their chemical signatures against known synthesis routes, and cross-referenced those routes with international shipping data obtained through customs partnerships. The conclusion was specific and startling. A substantial portion of the fentanyl reaching American streets was not entering through the southern border at all. It was arriving through the mail, not through cartel mules, not through tunnels or vehicle compartments, or the elaborate smuggling architectures that border enforcement had spent decades learning to detect, through the United States Postal Service. In packages, shipped from Chinese chemical companies to American addresses, sometimes commercial, sometimes residential, sometimes mail forwarding services that added an additional layer of geographic confusion. The packages were small enough to move through automated sorting systems without triggering weight-based screening. They were labelled with customs declarations that described their contents as personal care products, automotive parts, electronic components. Between 2013 and 2017, the Postal Service processed approximately 319 million inbound international packages annually. At the time of the Senate investigation that eventually exposed the full scale of the problem, the Postal Service was collecting advanced electronic data, the sender, recipient, and content information that allowed for targeted screening on approximately 36% of those packages. The remaining 64% arrived with no advanced data, meaning customs agents had no mechanism to identify them as targets for inspection without physically opening every package in that category. Every package, physically, 319 million. The math made targeted interdiction essentially theoretical, and the Chinese companies shipping fentanyl knew it. Yuncheng Group was not the only operation. By 2016, DEA and Homeland Security investigations had identified more than a dozen Chinese chemical companies openly advertising fentanyl and fentanyl analogues for sale to international customers. Their websites were not hidden. They were indexed by search engines. Some had customer review sections. One, examined by a Senate investigative committee, had a frequently asked questions page that addressed, in English, how to describe package contents to avoid customs scrutiny. The companies operated legally under Chinese law because Chinese law, until 2015, and then more comprehensively until 2019, did not schedule most synthetic opioid analogues. Fentanyl itself was scheduled. But the structural analogues, compounds that differed from fentanyl by a single molecule, that produced nearly identical effects, that were synthesized specifically to stay one chemical step ahead of scheduling lists, were not. When one compound was scheduled, chemists modified the structure slightly, and the new compound was technically legal again. This was not a loophole, it was a methodology. The DEA's forensic laboratory had identified more than 30 distinct fentanyl analogues in seized samples between 2014 and 2017, each one representing a chemical adjustment made specifically in response to a scheduling action. The regulatory apparatus was moving on a timeline of months. The chemical adjustments were being made in days. One of those analogues was furanil fentanyl, which appeared in Ohio Street supply samples in late 2015 and was responsible for a cluster of 17 overdose deaths in a single week in Akron, before the compound had even been formally identified by state toxicologists. Another was acryl fentanyl, which arrived in 2016 with a potency profile that caused a wave of overdoses in British Columbia before American health authorities had begun testing for it. And then there was the counterfeit pill problem, which was something else entirely, something that would shatter the remaining boundaries of who was considered at risk. The pressed pill operation had been developing quietly since approximately 2015, first identified in Phoenix and San Diego, before spreading eastward through distribution networks that moved with the efficiency of any commercial logistics chain. The pills were indistinguishable from pharmaceutical products, pressed on the same kind of equipment used by legitimate manufacturers, stamped with the same imprint codes that appeared on genuine medications, packaged in ways that mimicked prescription bottles, closely enough to deceive anyone without a laboratory. A pill stamped M30, the imprint of a legitimate 30 mg oxycodone tablet, that had been manufactured in a clandestine press contained not oxycodone but fentanyl. The quantity of fentanyl per pill varied according to how thoroughly the powder had been mixed during pressing. Some pills contained 2 micrograms, some contained 200. The difference between those two numbers, in a drug measured in micrograms, was the difference between a high and a funeral. Because fentanyl does not distribute evenly through a pressed powder mixture without pharmaceutical-grade mixing equipment, the variation was not consistent even within a single batch. Adjacent pills pressed from the same mixture could contain wildly different concentrations. DEA laboratory analysis of seized counterfeit M30 pills in 2017 found that approximately 4 out of every 10 pills contained a potentially lethal dose. 4 out of 10. This was not the heroin supply anymore. This was not a drug that required any familiarity with addiction, any connection to street networks, any personal history with opioid dependency. This was a pill that looked exactly like a prescription painkiller, available for purchase through apps on a smartphone, delivered by people who looked like any other delivery driver, bought by people who had never touched heroin and would have recoiled from the suggestion that they ever would. Trevor Campos was 17 years old when he bought what he believed was a Percocet from a classmate at Desert Ridge High School in Mesa, Arizona, in March of 2017. He was not someone the existing narrative of the opioid crisis had room for. He played junior varsity soccer. He had a part-time job at a car wash on Power Road. His mother later told investigators that he had never been in serious trouble, had never shown signs of dependency, had mentioned the pill only incidentally in a later conversation, as something he had taken on a weekend when his back was sore from a game. A single pill, bought for $10, taken in his bedroom on a Saturday afternoon. His mother found him 2 hours later. She called 911. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. He was already gone. The toxicology report confirmed fentanyl at a concentration consistent with the M30 counterfeit pills that Phoenix area law enforcement had been tracking for several months. The pill Trevor bought had been pressed from a batch seized 3 weeks later in a raid on an apartment in Tempe, an apartment where investigators found a pill press, 2 kilograms of fentanyl powder, and 4,800 completed M30 tablets, each one visually identical to a pharmaceutical oxycodone pill. Trevor Campos had no opioid history, no dependency, no connection to any drug network beyond a single transaction with a classmate who had not known, himself, what he was selling. He was the new face of the fentanyl crisis, and he was not exceptional. His death was one of an accelerating cluster of identical cases, teenagers and young adults with no prior drug use history, dying from single exposure contact with counterfeit pills that were arriving in medical examiner offices across Arizona, California, Florida, and Texas faster than the case files could be processed. The DEA issued a public warning about counterfeit M30 pills in September 2017. By the time the warning was issued, the pills had been in circulation for at least 2 years. Marcus Webb read about the counterfeit pill problem in a 2-paragraph item in the Columbus Dispatch in the fall of 2017. He had been aware of fentanyl in the supply for years, had felt it, had managed around it, had developed an intuitive calibration for batch quality that was based on nothing more reliable than experience. He was 34 years old. He had tried treatment twice, once at the county facility in 2011, where he had lasted 22 days before leaving against medical advice, and once through a private program in Columbus in 2014, which had cost him $11,000 borrowed from his sister Carla, and had ended when he relapsed 3 weeks after discharge. He was not unaware of his situation. He had a specific and unsentimental understanding of what his life had become and what its trajectory implied. He carried that understanding the way a person carries a medical diagnosis, present, continuous, factored into every calculation. What he did not have was information about what was in the specific batch he was buying on any specific Tuesday. He had no test strips. He had no way to obtain them legally. He had a tolerance built over 14 years that had pushed his required dose to levels that would have been fatal to someone without that tolerance, which meant that a miscalculation in either direction, too little, and he went into withdrawal, too much and his respiratory system slowed past the threshold of recovery, had almost no margin of safety on either side. He had survived this long through a combination of routine, caution, and probability. Probability was the part he couldn't control. What nobody had yet told Marcus Webb, what nobody had yet told almost anyone on any street in any American city, was that the substance now entering the supply in increasing quantities wasn't just fentanyl anymore. The carfentanil detected by DEA field offices in July 2016 had not been a temporary contamination event. It had become a persistent feature of the supply in Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia, It was in the batches. It was invisible. And it was so potent that the naloxone protocols Dana Kowalski had been trained on, the protocols that specified one dose, then wait, then reassess, were being quietly revised upward by emergency medicine physicians who were seeing patients who required 3, 4, 5 doses to maintain reversal. The man in the silver Honda on Salem Avenue who needed 3 doses in November 2016 had carfentanil in his system, not just fentanyl. The toxicology report confirming this arrived on a desk at the Montgomery County Coroner's Office 6 weeks after that night. Dana Kowalski never received a copy. Nobody called her. Nobody updated the protocol. She was still carrying 2 doses of naloxone per call when the carfentanil wave was already moving through the supply like a current beneath a current, invisible from the surface, pulling downward. The number that broke something in the public health establishment was not 50,000, though that year came and went without adequate response. It was not 70,000, though that number prompted a presidential declaration of a public health emergency that came with almost no new federal funding attached to it. The number that finally produced a genuine institutional reckoning was 80,000, the overdose death toll for 2021, a figure so far beyond any previous benchmark that the CDC's own mortality statisticians flagged their preliminary data for internal review, suspecting a processing error. There was no error. The year 2020 had added a variable that nobody in the overdose prevention infrastructure had adequately prepared for, a global pandemic that simultaneously disrupted drug supply chains, shuttered treatment facilities, isolated people in active addiction from whatever thin networks of human support they had maintained, and eliminated the sparse physical presence of harm reduction workers in the communities where they were most needed. Overdose deaths, already climbing, accelerated in a vertical line through 2020 and into 2021. In some counties, monthly overdose fatalities tripled between February and June of 2020, a spike so steep that emergency management systems designed to handle mass casualty events were being quietly assessed for potential deployment in response to what was, by every metric, a mass casualty event that had simply been arriving one body at a time for 15 years. Dayton's fire stations had added a dedicated overdose response protocol. Every engine company carried naloxone. Every firefighter had been trained in its administration. The protocol called for a minimum of 2 doses on initial response, with additional doses staged in the vehicle for immediate access. 2 doses was no longer adequate for a meaningful percentage of calls. Dana Kowalski had left the ambulance by 2019. Her back had been a problem since 2016, the cumulative physical consequence of 14 years of lifting, manoeuvring, and performing emergency procedures in the cramped geometries of vehicle interiors and stairwells and parking lots. The injury was not dramatic. A herniated disc at L4 to L5 that had responded adequately to conservative treatment, but that made sustained heavy lifting not just painful but dangerous. The department's medical review board had cleared her for light duty. She had requested reassignment rather than a desk position, and had spent 2 years training new EMTs before the desk became the only remaining option. She left in March of 2019, cleaned out her locker, took the legal pad, handed in her badge. The legal pad now had 9 years of tallies on it. She kept it on her kitchen table for 3 weeks after leaving the department, turning it over in her hands sometimes in the evenings. Then she put it in a folder in a drawer and started making calls. The organisation she found was called Dayton Fuse, a harm reduction non-profit operating out of a converted storefront on West 3rd Street, staffed primarily by people with personal histories of addiction and funded through a patchwork of county grants and private donations that required constant renewal. They distributed clean needles. They distributed fentanyl test strips, which had been decriminalized in Ohio in 2019 after years of advocacy. They trained community members in naloxone administration and gave it away free. They had a van that ran 3 nights a week through the same streets where Dana had run calls for 14 years. She started volunteering 2 days a week in June of 2019. By September, she was there 5 days a week. By January 2020, she was the organization's field coordinator, a position that came with a salary roughly equivalent to what a first-year EMT earned, and that required her to be present frequently at the scenes of overdoses she was now responding to, not with an ambulance, but with naloxone she carried in a canvas bag over her shoulder. The work was different from emergency medicine in ways she found difficult to articulate to people who asked. Emergency medicine was intervention, arriving at the end of a sequence of events, reversing an immediate crisis, transporting. Harm reduction was something slower and more complicated. It required being present before the crisis, in the ordinary texture of people's lives, in a way that the structure of emergency response had never permitted. She met Marcus Webb in February of 2020 at a needle exchange session held on Tuesday evenings at the Fuse storefront. Webb was 37 years old by then. He had been through a third treatment attempt in 2018, a medication-assisted treatment program in Columbus that had prescribed buprenorphine, a partial opioid agonist that occupied the brain's receptors without producing a full opioid effect, reducing withdrawal and cravings without the overdose risk of full agonists. The program had worked better than anything he had tried before. He had been stable on buprenorphine for 4 months, was attending weekly appointments, had started picking up occasional carpentry work through a contractor he had known for years. Then his insurance coverage changed. The new plan required prior authorization for buprenorphine, a process that involved paperwork from his prescribing physician, a review period of up to 15 business days, and a specific diagnostic coding requirement that his physician's office had not been aware of. During the authorization gap, he could not access his medication legally. He could not afford to pay out of pocket. The monthly cost without coverage was over $400. Within 11 days, he was back in withdrawal. Within 18 days, he was back in the supply. The prior authorization delay that ended Marcus Webb's longest period of stability was not an unusual event. A 2019 American Society of Addiction Medicine survey found that prior authorization requirements for buprenorphine affected approximately 30% of patients attempting to access medication-assisted treatment, with delays averaging 12 days. During those 12 days, patients who had achieved stability relapsed at rates that the survey's authors described, with unusual directness for an academic publication, as predictable and preventable. Webb knew about the Fuse storefront from a flyer that had been taped to a telephone pole on Monument Avenue for 6 months before he walked through the door. The overdose that almost ended things in the summer of 2019 did not happen in a parking lot or a bathroom, or any of the locations that populated the geographic imagination of the crisis. It happened in a public library on East 3rd Street, in a single-occupancy restroom, on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:15. Webb had used in a quantity calibrated to his current tolerance, using supply from a source he'd been buying from for 8 months. The batch was different. He recognized the difference approximately 90 seconds after administration, the same quality of wrongness he had first encountered in 2013, the too fast onset, the ceiling arriving before it should. He had just enough presence of mind in that narrowing window to unlock the restroom door before losing consciousness. A library patron tried the handle 11 minutes later, found resistance, pushed the door open against his weight. She was a retired schoolteacher named Beverly, age 71, who had never administered naloxone and had never encountered an overdose. She knew what she was looking at. She'd seen the training poster on the wall of the library's community room for 2 years. She retrieved the naloxone kit mounted in the hallway, one of 42 public naloxone stations the county had installed in libraries, community centres, and government buildings the previous year, and followed the instructions printed on the outside of the box. 1 dose. Webb was breathing again within 40 seconds. He was conscious by the time the paramedics arrived. He sat against the wall of the restroom with his knees pulled up and stared at the fluorescent light fixture on the ceiling for a long time. Beverly sat on the floor beside him, not touching him, not speaking to him, just present, until the ambulance crew came through the door. He never learned her last name. By 2020, the overdose death toll had a new dimension that the statistics alone could not fully communicate. The population dying had shifted in composition in ways that the early years of the crisis had not predicted. The age range had expanded dramatically. People in their 50s and 60s, adults who had managed prescription opioid dependency for a decade and then transitioned to illicit supply, were now dying at rates that gerontologists were describing as a hidden crisis within the crisis. The demographic range had expanded equally. Black Americans, who had been partially insulated from the early prescription opioid wave because prescribers had systematically undertreated pain in black patients, a documented pattern of medical racism that had, with grotesque irony, produced an accidental protective effect, were now dying of fentanyl overdoses at rates that had tripled since 2015, as fentanyl contaminated the cocaine supply in addition to the heroin supply. Cocaine. The fentanyl contamination had reached cocaine. The mechanism was partly economic, partly logistical. Fentanyl had become so ubiquitous in illicit drug manufacturing infrastructure that cross-contamination of cocaine batches, through shared equipment, shared cutting surfaces, shared supply chain participants who handled both products, was occurring without deliberate intent. Some of the cocaine-related fentanyl deaths involved people who had never used opioids in their lives and had no opioid tolerance whatsoever. Their bodies responded to trace quantities of fentanyl the way an opioid-naive person's body always responds, catastrophically. DEA laboratory analysis confirmed fentanyl presence in cocaine samples from 38 states by the end of 2021, methamphetamine samples from 22 states. The drug was not respecting its own category anymore. It had become an environmental contaminant in the illicit drug supply, present where it had not been placed intentionally, reaching people who had made no decision that included any awareness of fentanyl as a possibility. Marcus Webb was found in his apartment on Watt Street on a Tuesday morning in November 2019. His sister Carla had always had a key, had used it to check on him with a frequency that had increased in direct proportion to her understanding of what the supply had become in the preceding 3 years. She had last spoken to him on Sunday. He had sounded stable. He had mentioned that he was thinking about calling the Fuse storefront again, about going back to the medication program, about something a person at the needle exchange had told him about a new treatment option that didn't require daily clinic visits. He was 36 years old. The toxicology report took 3 weeks. Carla called the coroner's office twice during that period, both times speaking to a clerk who was professionally courteous and unable to expedite. The report, when it arrived, confirmed the presence of carfentanil mixed into a heroin sample, a batch that had circulated through the Ross County supply that same week, and that was linked, through subsequent DEA tracing, to a synthesis operation in Sinaloa State that had been using carfentanil as a potency extender since at least early 2019. Marcus Webb had no fentanyl test strips. The source he had used the previous Tuesday was the same source he had used for 9 months. He had no reason to expect the composition had changed. He had no way to know. Carla Webb sat in her car outside the coroner's office for 45 minutes after picking up the report. Then she drove home to the house on Delano Avenue where they had both grown up, where the porch still sagged on the left side, where their father had once fixed the furnace at 3 in the morning so they could sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the report in front of her and called her brother's phone number, knowing exactly what would happen because some actions are not about outcome. It went to voicemail. His voice on the outgoing message was from 2016. He had never updated it. The CDC would later confirm that 2019 represented, at the time, the deadliest year for drug overdoses in American history. 71,000 deaths. Fentanyl and fentanyl analogues, present in more than 60% of those cases. That record would stand for exactly 1 year before 2020 broke it, and then 2021 broke 2020, and then 2022 broke 2021. Each year its own record. Each year the number that was supposed to be the ceiling became the floor. The responses came. Eventually, haltingly, in the specific bureaucratic rhythm of systems acknowledging emergencies they had spent years categorizing as manageable problems, the responses came. China scheduled fentanyl and all of its analogues as controlled substances in May of 2019, following 2 years of sustained diplomatic pressure from the United States government that included direct negotiations at the highest levels of both administrations. The announcement was significant. The direct mail pipeline from Chinese chemical companies to American zip codes slowed measurably within months. DEA seizure data showed a 70% reduction in Chinese-origin fentanyl packages intercepted by customs in the 18 months following the scheduling action. 70% sounds like success. The other 30% continued moving. More critically, the scheduling action had not eliminated the underlying chemical knowledge or the precursor supply chains. What it had done was accelerate a transition that the cartels had already begun, moving from importing finished fentanyl from China to importing the precursor chemicals, the raw building blocks, and synthesizing fentanyl themselves in Mexico in laboratories that were more sophisticated than anything the Toluca operation of 2006 had suggested was possible. The CJNG had, by 2019, developed synthesis operations that DEA forensic analysts described as approaching pharmaceutical grade in their consistency and output capacity. The scheduling action had not ended fentanyl production. It had relocated it and, in doing so, brought it under the control of organizations with far greater distribution infrastructure than Chinese mail-order chemical companies had ever possessed. The supply did not decrease. It reorganized. The Stop Act became law in October 2018, requiring international mail carriers, including critically the Postal Service, to collect advanced electronic data on all inbound packages by the end of 2020. The legislation had been drafted specifically in response to the Senate investigation that revealed the Postal Service's role as an inadvertent distribution network, and it closed the data gap that had made targeted screening effectively impossible. Customs agents could now identify high-risk packages before they arrived at sorting facilities, allowing for interdiction without the physical impossibility of opening every international parcel. The Stop Act worked, in the narrow technical sense that it was designed to work. Postal fentanyl seizures increased. The direct-from-China individual shipment model became significantly more difficult to sustain. What it did not, could not address was the supply that was already inside the country. Years of unimpeded Chinese shipments had seeded fentanyl and its analogues throughout the American distribution network. The domestic supply chain no longer needed international replenishment on the same timeline it once had. And the cartel-synthesized fentanyl moving through traditional border corridors, now the primary source, was not moving through the Postal Service at all. It was moving in vehicles, in quantities per crossing that reflected the extraordinary potency-to-volume ratio that made fentanyl so different from every drug that had preceded it. A single kilogram, easily concealed, containing enough doses to supply a medium-sized city for a week. The border was not a solution. The border had never been the right frame. Naloxone moved quietly toward accessibility during these same years in a policy progression that happened state by state, with enough variation to constitute, in practice, a different public health system in every state simultaneously. Ohio made naloxone available without prescription in 2015. By 2023, 47 states had done the same. The FDA approved an over-the-counter nasal spray formulation in March of 2023. Narcan, the brand name that had become generic in common usage the way Kleenex had become the word for tissue, making it purchasable without any prescription or pharmacist consultation at any pharmacy that chose to stock it. The availability expanded the number of reversals. Studies in states with early naloxone access laws consistently showed reduced overdose mortality compared to states that delayed, not dramatically, not enough to bend the overall curve, but measurably. In specific communities, measurably. Fentanyl test strips travelled a slower, more contested legislative path. The paraphernalia classification that made them illegal in most states had been embedded in drug laws for decades, and changing it required individual state legislative action against the political friction of appearing to facilitate drug use. North Carolina decriminalized them in 2016. A handful of states followed. The federal government removed the paraphernalia classification at the federal level in the Omnibus Spending Bill of March 2022, clearing the path for states to follow without federal legal conflict. By 2023, 32 states had decriminalized fentanyl test strips. Studies measuring the effect in communities where they were distributed free alongside naloxone showed overdose rates declining by between 18% and 40% in the specific populations reached. People used them. Given the option of knowing what was in their supply, people checked. The strips cost between 50 cents and $1 each. The pharmaceutical accountability reckoning arrived through courtrooms rather than legislation, in a series of settlements and verdicts that restructured the financial landscape of the companies most responsible for constructing the prescription opioid foundation on which the fentanyl crisis had been built. Purdue Pharma, the manufacturer of OxyContin, reached a bankruptcy settlement in 2022 after years of litigation from state attorneys general and municipalities. The settlement value was approximately $6 billion, to be distributed across plaintiff states for addiction treatment and prevention purposes. The Sackler family, Purdue's controlling owners, contributed approximately $4.5 billion personally, while retaining, through the settlement's original structure, broad legal immunity from future civil claims. That immunity was challenged, stripped by the Supreme Court in a 2024 ruling, and the litigation continued. Johnson & Johnson, which had acquired Janssen Pharmaceutica, manufacturer of Duragesic, in 1961, settled opioid-related claims with state attorneys general for $5 billion in 2021 without admitting liability. The settlement covered the company's role in marketing fentanyl patches for populations beyond their approved use, among other opioid products. The numbers were large enough to produce headlines. Measured against the estimated $1 trillion in total economic cost that the opioid epidemic has imposed on the American economy since 1999, a figure calculated by the CDC that includes healthcare expenditure, lost productivity, criminal justice costs, and child welfare interventions. They represented a fraction of a fraction. Carla Webb learned about the Purdue settlement on the news. She turned the television off. She had testified before the Senate Subcommittee on Health in September of 2022 as part of a panel of family members organized by a non-profit that connected survivors of overdose loss with legislative advocacy opportunities. The hearing was titled Preventing Overdose Deaths: What More Can Be Done. Carla Webb was the third of 5 speakers. She did not speak about policy. She did not cite statistics or reference legislative proposals. She carried a photograph of her brother at 19, a construction site, summer, squinting into the sun with a water bottle in his hand and sawdust on his jeans. And she described the last ordinary conversation she had with him 2 days before he died, in which he had talked about going back to the treatment program and mentioned that the leaves on the maple tree in the backyard of the house on Delano Avenue had started turning, and that he had always liked that particular tree in October. The photograph was entered into the hearing record. The senators in the room were quiet for longer than the proceedings' formal structure required. Now the twist that changes the geography of responsibility, the one that the focus on cartels and Chinese labs had been quietly obscuring for years. A 2022 study published by researchers at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health examined the sourcing of fentanyl found in street samples across 12 metropolitan areas and cross-referenced those samples against DEA pharmaceutical diversion data. The records of legally manufactured fentanyl that was reported stolen, lost, or otherwise removed from the legitimate pharmaceutical supply chain. Hospitals, surgical centres, ambulatory care facilities, veterinary practices, and compounding pharmacies collectively reported tens of thousands of units of pharmaceutical fentanyl lost or stolen annually. The Johns Hopkins analysis found that diverted pharmaceutical fentanyl, the drug manufactured legally, under FDA oversight, in licensed American facilities, represented a persistent and non-negligible percentage of street supply in certain metropolitan markets, particularly in the Northeast. Not the dominant source, not the primary driver, but present, contributing. Real. The system that had originally released fentanyl into community medicine cabinets through patch prescriptions was still, quietly, decades later, feeding the street supply through a different mechanism. The front door of the pharmaceutical supply chain had been reinforced. The back door had not been fully closed. Paul Janssen's molecule, manufactured to pharmaceutical purity in licensed American facilities, was still finding its way to the same streets where the cartel synthesized version was killing people. Two versions of the same compound, arriving through completely different pathways, meeting at the same destination. Dana Kowalski found out about the Johns Hopkins study through a colleague at Fuse who sent her the abstract in a text message with no accompanying commentary. She read it twice at the storefront, then set her phone face down on the desk and looked at the wall for a while. The wall had a whiteboard on it. The whiteboard tracked the organization's weekly metrics: naloxone kits distributed, test strips distributed, referrals to treatment made, overdose reversals reported by community members who had used the organization's training and supplies. The reversal column had 31 marks in it for the month of October 2022. 31 people who had been reached by someone carrying naloxone obtained through this organization in this storefront, funded by grants that required annual reapplication and whose continuation was never guaranteed past the current fiscal year. She ran the math. 31 reversals in 1 month at one organization in one city. The reversal did not equal recovery. Recovery required treatment access, housing stability, insurance coverage, a medical system willing to prescribe buprenorphine without a prior authorization gauntlet, a community with enough remaining capacity for connection to make survival feel worth sustaining. The reversal was a beginning. What came after it was a different system entirely, and that system was still, in most of America, inadequate in ways that were specific, documented and unfunded. She added a 30-second mark to the board. Then she picked up her bag, refilled her naloxone supply from the cabinet, and walked out to the van for the Tuesday night run. The maple tree on Delano Avenue had turned 3 Octobers without Marcus Webb underneath it. The house still stood. The porch still sagged on the left side, though Carla had hired someone to reinforce the support beam the previous spring. Some things get fixed. Some things get fixed too late. The question that remained, the one that all the settlements and legislation and harm reduction infrastructure had not yet answered, was whether the distance between those two categories was a permanent feature of the American response to this crisis, or something that could still be changed. Nobody had a number for that. Not yet. The call came in at 2:47 in the morning. A man, unresponsive, slumped behind the wheel of a silver Honda Civic parked on the corner of Salem Avenue and Apple Street in Dayton, Ohio. Engine still running, hazard lights blinking in the November dark. Dana Kowalski pulled the naloxone before her partner finished parking. She knew the address, not this specific corner, but this specific quarter-mile radius, which had appeared in her personal log more times than any other location in 14 years. The streetlight on the corner had been out for 3 months. She worked by the light mounted on her kit. She administered the first dose. Nothing. She had been here before. Not this man, not this car, but this exact moment. The 30 seconds of waiting, the face that didn't change, the recalibration of everything she thought she knew about how much naloxone a human body could absorb without responding. She'd been having this moment with increasing frequency for 2 years, and she had not, until this particular November night, understood precisely what it meant. The second dose. Still nothing. Her partner handed her the third without being asked. That exchange. No words, just a syringe extended across the console of an ambulance at 3 a.m, represented 14 years of accumulated understanding compressed into a single gesture. The third dose brought the man back. What Dana Kowalski did not know, standing on Salem Avenue in November 2016, was that the answer to the question she'd been carrying for 2 years was already written down. It existed in a DEA forensic report dated July 2016, in a CDC internal analysis dated September 2013, in a series of emails between federal health officials that would not become public for another 4 years, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed by an investigative journalist at ProPublica named Sandra Chen, who'd been covering the opioid crisis since 2014, and who had developed a specific methodical obsession with the gap between what federal agencies knew and when they had chosen to act on that knowledge. Chen's FOIA request took 22 months to produce results. When the documents arrived, 847 pages, partially redacted, delivered on a USB drive in a manila envelope. She read them across 3 consecutive days, sleeping 4 hours each night, making notes in a legal pad that she later described as the most important document she had personally produced in 15 years of journalism. The CDC analysis dated September 2013 was 11 pages long. It projected, using mortality trend modeling based on fentanyl's rate of entry into the heroin supply in Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia, that overdose deaths would reach 50,000 annually by 2017 if intervention was not implemented at scale. The projection proved accurate to within 4%. The document had been circulated to senior CDC officials, to the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and to the Department of Health and Human Services. No emergency response followed. No public warning was issued. What followed was a series of interagency meetings documented in subsequent emails, in which officials from different federal departments debated jurisdiction, whether fentanyl contamination of the heroin supply was primarily a law enforcement problem, a public health problem, or a substance abuse treatment problem, and which agency therefore bore primary responsibility for response coordination. The debate ran for 14 months. During those 14 months, approximately 28,000 Americans died of opioid overdoses, in which fentanyl was a contributing factor. The 2013 document was not the earliest. Chen found an earlier one, a DEA intelligence report dated March 2010, produced in the immediate aftermath of the OxyContin reformulation, which modeled the likely behavioral response of opioid-dependent Americans to the loss of accessible prescription supply. The report predicted with specific geographic detail that heroin use would increase substantially in the Midwest and Appalachian regions, that existing heroin supply chains would be stressed to expand rapidly, and that the expansion of supply chains created conditions favorable for adulteration with synthetic opioids including fentanyl. The report recommended pre-positioning naloxone supplies in the affected regions, expanding medication-assisted treatment capacity, and establishing a real-time toxicology surveillance system that would allow local health departments to identify new substances in the supply within days rather than weeks. None of the three recommendations were implemented at federal scale before 2016. The naloxone recommendation was implemented partially at the state level in Ohio in 2015, 5 years after the DEA had identified it as urgent. The toxicology surveillance system, a network that would have detected carfentanil in the supply weeks before the delayed public warning of August 2016, potentially reducing the body count of that specific wave, was funded by Congress in 2017. It became operational in 2018. Sandra Chen published her investigation in March of 2020, 12 days before the pandemic lockdowns began. The story received significant coverage for 72 hours. Then the pandemic displaced everything else from the front page and the coverage stopped. Paul Janssen died on November 11, 2003. He was 77 years old, and he died in the city of Beers, Belgium, a few miles from the backroom laboratory where he had started everything 50 years earlier. His death was noted with genuine mourning in the global pharmaceutical community. Obituaries described him as one of the most productive medicinal chemists in the history of the field, a man whose compounds had treated conditions ranging from pain to psychosis to fungal infection, whose name was attached to more pharmaceutically active molecules than almost any individual in the discipline's history. He died 1 year before the Duragesic patch began its accelerating spread beyond cancer wards into general pain management. He died 3 years before the first major street fentanyl outbreak in Chicago and Detroit. He died 16 years before carfentanil entered the street supply in Ohio. His last published interview, given to a Belgian science journal in 2002, included a question about which of his compounds he considered his most significant achievement. His answer was fentanyl. He described it as a drug that had given anesthesiologists the ability to perform procedures that would otherwise have been too dangerous, that had made surgery safer for millions of people over 4 decades, that had done exactly what he had designed it to do. He was right. He was right about everything he knew about. What he could not have known, what no one standing in a Belgian laboratory in 1960 could have modelled, was the 60-year sequence of corporate decisions, regulatory failures, political inertia, economic desperation, and global chemistry that would transform his precise surgical instrument into a molecule distributed in the billions of doses through a supply chain invisible to the people consuming it. He had built a key. Other people had opened doors with it that he had never seen and never imagined. The man in the silver Honda survived November 2016. He was taken to Miami Valley Hospital, treated and released. His name never appeared in any public record connected to this story. He was alive. In the weeks following that night, the Montgomery County Coroner's Office processed the toxicology results from the cluster of overdoses that had required 3 or more doses of naloxone during that same period. The results confirmed what Dana Kowalski had intuited from the street: carfentanil, not just fentanyl, detectable in the samples. The coroner's office sent the results to the Ohio Department of Health. The department included the finding in a quarterly report. The report recommended updated naloxone protocols for emergency responders. The updated protocol, recommending a minimum of 3 doses for suspected opioid overdose in Montgomery County, was distributed to area fire and EMS departments in February 2017, 14 weeks after the November cluster. Dana Kowalski received the updated protocol in her departmental email on a Tuesday morning. She read it at her desk between calls. She printed it out. She walked to her locker where the legal pad was, and she added a notation at the bottom of November's page, not the tally marks, but a sentence. Updated protocol. February 2017, 3 doses minimum. Carfentanil confirmed. Then she closed the pad and went back to her desk. The protocol that should have existed in July 2016, when the DEA first confirmed carfentanil in Ohio samples, had arrived in February 2017. 7 months. During those 7 months, the number of calls in Montgomery County requiring more than 2 doses of naloxone had been documented by paramedics and firefighters who, like Dana, had been carrying the knowledge of what they were encountering without having the official language to name it or the authorized resources to address it. They had adapted. The way frontline people always adapt, by making individual decisions that the system had not sanctioned and that the system would later formalize once the individual decisions had demonstrated their necessity at sufficient cost. The final shape of the fentanyl crisis, as it exists in 2024, is not the shape of a disaster with a clear origin and a clear villain. It is the shape of a system, a legal pharmaceutical industry that constructed mass opioid dependency and externalized the costs onto communities that had no mechanism to refuse, a regulatory apparatus that moved on institutional timelines while a chemical moved at market speed, a global drug trade that adapted to every interdiction measure with the flexibility of any competitive commercial enterprise, and a political response that consistently identified the crisis 3 to 5 years after the critical intervention window had already passed. It is also the shape of Beverly, the retired schoolteacher, who read an instruction card and saved a life in a library restroom. Of the 32 marks on a whiteboard in a storefront on West 3rd Street in October 2022. Of the fentanyl test strip 50 cents that a harm reduction worker places in someone's hand on a Tuesday night in Dayton. Those 2 shapes coexist in the same crisis, in the same city, on the same streets. The man in the Honda is still alive. Beverly never knew his name. Dana Kowalski drives the van on Tuesdays. Carla Webb keeps a photograph of her brother on the kitchen table of the house on Delano Avenue, next to the window that faces the maple tree. In a suburb of Phoenix, the family of Trevor Campos has established a foundation. They distribute naloxone to high school athletic programs across Maricopa County. They have trained over 4,000 coaches, parents, and student volunteers in administration. They have documented 11 reversals attributable to their training, 11 people in parking lots and locker rooms and a high school gymnasium, reached by someone who knew what to do because a teenager's parents decided to do something with the only resource they had left. 11 people, by name, by location, documented in a spreadsheet that Trevor's mother updates herself on the last Sunday of every month at the kitchen table. The overdose death toll for 2023 was 112,000. The preliminary data for 2024 suggested a possible decline, the first in 9 years, of approximately 3%. The CDC attributed the potential reduction to expanded naloxone access, increased fentanyl test strip distribution, and growth in medication-assisted treatment enrollment. 3%. After 9 consecutive years of record-setting mortality, a potential decline of 3% was being described in public health circles as meaningful progress. Whether it was the beginning of a sustained reversal or a statistical fluctuation in a crisis that had not fundamentally changed was a question that would not be answerable for another 2 or 3 years of data. The people who work in harm reduction, in emergency medicine, in addiction treatment, in the houses on streets in every county that the crisis has reached, they do not have the luxury of waiting for longitudinal data to interpret what they are experiencing. They are experiencing it now, in real time, with whatever tools are available, a fentanyl test strip, a dose of naloxone. A van running Tuesday nights through streets where the light on the corner has been out for 3 months. Paul Jansen built a key. What America built around it is a question that 112,000 people per year are answering with their lives, and the answer keeps changing, and the number keeps moving, and somewhere in Dayton on a November night, an ambulance parks on a dark corner, and a paramedic pulls naloxone from a kit and begins counting seconds, and the only question that matters is whether 3 doses will be enough this time. It was, that night. It isn't, always.